All right, so we are going to continue our exploration of the diversity of life from our microorganisms into plants and fungi. So, protists, if you remember, are eukaryotes, and there is a group of protists called algae. Algae is the sister group to plants, and then fungi are kind of a weird group. So, these are all different kingdoms of the domain eukarya, which means they are all eukaryotic cells. But then after that, how do we classify the different kinds of plants or the fungi or the animals or the protists, and how do we figure out what belongs where? So this particular chapter is going to be focusing on plants and fungi. Plants will be chapter 18, part 1. Fungi will be chapter 18, part 2. So let's get into it. Okay. Of course, our chapter objectives here, you should be able to answer all of these as questions. The biggest thing is identifying the significant events in the evolution of plants and then classifying the different groups of plants based on characteristics that we outline. I do have a chapter 18 table in Canvas as well if you want to use that as a way of taking notes. There is a plants option, and then there's a second page that is fungi. So I would suggest it because that is a good way for us to classify and compare the traits of these organisms. Okay, so when we look at plants, what makes something a plant as compared to an algae? Well, plants are all multicellular. So we do have some unicellular algae, which is going to be a differentiation between algae and plants. Plants are all photosynthetic, okay, unless they've lost that because they're parasites, but that's a weird outgroup. Remember, there are exceptions to every rule, but evolutionarily, ancestrally, plants are photosynthetic organisms. Plants are adapted to a land existence. So here's our big differentiation between algae and plants. Plants are able to handle the drying environment of air because living on land is very dry as compared to living in a body of water. Okay. Plants are able to handle working against gravity. Again, in water, we tend to have a neutral buoyancy. Think about if you go in water and you can float, that's going to be easier because water, you cannot float in air. Okay, unless you're in one of those wind tunnels, but that's again an exception to the rule. And then plants are able to handle UV damage. If you ever find algae washed up on shore at the beach or at a lake, generally speaking, that algae is going to dry out very quickly and it's going to become damaged from the UV radiation. So that's our big difference there. In order to adapt to this land existence, most plants have roots and shoots. And so we have systems that are responsible for anchoring plants in the soil and allowing them to absorb water and nutrients. And we have parts that are specialized for photosynthesis. Plants probably evolved from a freshwater algae or a common ancestor about 500 million years ago. And we do think that fungi played an important role in plants moving onto land and being successful in a land environment. We think that plants and algae are a sister group because they have a lot of homologous characteristics. They share chlorophylls A and B, they store excess carbohydrates as a starch, and they have cellulose in the cell walls. But algae are very different in how they are living in their environment. They are adapted to that environment, and then plants are adapted to the land environment. So that's our big differentiation there. Okay. Plants are characterized by 5 key evolutionary events. The first one that all plants share in common is that they protect their embryos. So again, when we are in a drying environment, okay, we cannot have our offspring, our embryos, just like tossed out into the dry air environment and expect them to develop effectively. When they're in water, there's no need to surround the embryo with any sort of desiccation proof coat or covering, but land plants have that characteristic. There are a couple of ways that plants addressed this, but that embryo protection is really key to all of our plant groups. Okay. After embryo protection, we start to see a development of a vascular tissue in form of xylem and phloem, and that is going to be how plants are moving nutrients and moisture around their bodies. Then we start to see development of large leaf structures called megaphylls. After our megaphylls, we start to see seeds. So embryo protection early in plants is in the form of something called spores, and we're going to talk about that in mosses and ferns. But then when we get into our larger groups of plants, your gymnosperms and angiosperms, we have seeds, the seeds that you're familiar with. Okay. And then finally, our last group of plants that is a big characterization of this group is going to be the flowers. Flowering plants are the dominant life on this planet as far as plants are concerned today. And so we're going to find these angiosperms everywhere. If you go out and you look at plants, the majority of them are going to be considered angiosperms, and they are going to have flowers. Whether or not you see those flowers is what we're going to talk about a little bit here. But before we get to our land plants, our angiosperms, our gymnosperms, even our ferns, we have to talk about a group that's a little bit weird. Our first group of plants is called the bryophytes. Okay, these are land plants. They do live on land, and they can actually live in some really dry environments. Your bryophytes are also known as non-vascular seedless plants. So these plants do not have xylem and phloem, and they do not have seeds. They have spores. They also don't have true roots or, like I said, that vascular tissue. They don't even really have true leaves in the same way. This is a very early evolutionary group of plants. This includes your mosses as well as your liverworts and hornworts, and there is a lot of evidence to suggest that liverworts were some of the first ones that moved on to land effectively. They are very algae-like. This group is very algae-like. If you go out and you look for mosses right now, you could find a moss, and moss is the best. It feels so cool, so I tell people all the time to touch moss. Um, we have a lot of moss here in North Carolina. You can find them in what we would consider more dry environments, but they're going to dry up and kind of go into a stasis until it rains. So when we do have periods of drought here in North Carolina, the moss isn't as green. But as soon as it gets just a little bit wet, like this, in the fall, it's been really rainy here in North Carolina in 2025. We are seeing a lot of those mosses becoming this really bright, vibrant green. And if you were to pick up some of those mosses and squeeze them, they would retain water like a sponge. This is going to be something that's characteristic of this because they form these mats. They form these kind of thick, sponge-like mats where they are kind of building up their own amount of soil, and then they are retaining that water. They actually do absorb water through osmosis across their cell structures of their little leaflets. They don't have true leaves at this point. They have microphyls. But they are very well adapted. There are mosses that can be found in the desert, for instance. There are mosses that can be found up north in the tundra. But we generally here, we want to find them, we go look under a tree, okay? Damp, wet, shady areas. They do reproduce sexually and asexually. When you have that growth in that mat, that's often an asexual reproduction. But if you ever find a moss that has what's called the capsules, these little kind of hooks that come up off of them, that is called the sporophyte. And that will be producing spores, which is a type of sexual reproduction. The spores can then be spread by wind or water, and if they find a new suitable habitat, will then grow into a new patch of moss. A very odd group in that, again, they don't have a lot of those key traits of what we look for in plants, like the xylem and the phloem, the roots and the shoots. But they are plants because they do fulfill the main characteristics of plants. And they have those desiccation-proof spores, which is how their embryos can move to new environments and not dry out. Okay? After our bryophytes, we have something called our pteridophytes. For a very long time, this was the dominant life on the planet. We had fern trees, we had a lot of different fern allies in the whisk ferns, club ferns, and horsetails. But this is a very common group still today. Again, though, if I'm going to look for them, I'm looking for them in the same places that I find mosses. They really prefer damp, wet, shady areas. They are well adapted to that sort of environment. They do have roots, stems, and leaves, and the leaves can be microphyls, like I have a picture here of horsetails that have these little rings that look kind of like a collar around parts of the stem. Those are the leaves of this plant. They're called microphyls. Or your ferns, those are called megaphylls, and they can get very, very, very large. These guys do have a root system called rhizomes, and so their roots are often growing horizontally, and then in each little division of the rhizome, you'll have a plant grow. That's a kind of way they asexually reproduce. So if you find a patch of ferns, even if they die back in the winter or when it's really dry, they will come back from the rhizomes, which is where they're going to store that starch. They do have usually very well-developed xylem and phloem, and they do have the capability of moving nutrients around those megaphils. They are going to produce sexually still through spores. So again, we don't see the development of seeds yet. While these organisms can get larger because they have the way to avoid gravity in those vascular systems, while they do have really well developed roots called rhizomes, they don't reproduce with seeds. They still have spores. If you've ever gotten ferns or looked at a fern and saw on the back of the fern these little brown dots on the leaves, sometimes they look like insect eggs, and people are like, "Oh gosh, this is insects in my fern." It's not. That is actually something called a sori, and those sori are how the ferns produce their spores. They produce them in the leaves. They don't have any like particular structure. A lot of ferns will have those sori. Some ferns and a lot of these other guys will produce things called strobili. So our horsetail here has a cone-like structure on the top. That's going to be producing spores. Or we have our whisk ferns. They also have those strobili-like structures. Some ferns do have that. There's something here in the woods called an ostrich fern, and they get huge, huge fronds. And they will have a specialized frond that is going to be just for reproduction. And so that's called a strobili. But it doesn't matter if it's a strobili or a sori, they are going to produce spores that are again spread by wind or water. Spores are very small, they're very light, and there are tons of them being produced. Once those spores are found in a new environment that is again really ideal for that growing organism, they will start developing into a new plant. So that is how we see the pteridophytes and the bryophytes reproducing. Once we get past these two, what we would consider earlier types of plants as far as evolution, because if we go back here, remember we're looking at the earliest plant being our mosses, and then we have a split into your lycophytes and ferns. Now we're going to talk about seeds. Seeds were a huge game changer for plants, okay? Having seeds meant that these plants did not have to immediately start growing once they were found in a new environment. So when these mosses and ferns are producing spores, they're only going to produce those at a time when the juvenile plant, the new growing embryo, can develop into a full plant. And so they're not able to produce year round. And if those spores land in an environment that isn't ideal at the time, like say it's a little dry, but it might be wet at a different time, they won't grow. So seeds became really a huge step forward in plant evolution because the seed coat and stored food of the seeds allowed the embryo to wait. It allowed the embryo to wait until environmental conditions were favorable. And so there can be very, very long periods of time between the seed being produced and it actually developing a new plant. A lot of us keep dried beans potentially in our cupboards. If you were to get some of those beans out and soak them in water for a little bit and then let them just sit on a damp paper towel, those beans will still germinate. Those are still viable beans to produce an embryo, and we will see that in our pines and our angiosperms, so our gymnosperms and our angiosperms. The survival of seeds is huge because, again, we can overwinter. Okay, if the seed is produced and it's sitting in an environment and it's not ideal, it's too cold, the sunlight isn't right, there's not enough moisture, that seed can just sit and wait. Now there's a timeline for all seeds, but some things can last 20, 30 years before they even sprout, and that's because they are waiting for that cue, whatever that environmental cue is, that it's the right environment. Okay. Gymnosperms are considered naked seeds. So they are produced in cones, and those cones do not have any sort of fleshy fruit. So when we have our gymnosperms, they are going to have a seed that's going to have a seed coat still. Seed coats are in our seeds. That seed coat is a protective layer. And they're going to have something called endosperm that is going to be a stored food. We have that in both our gymnosperms and our angiosperms. The gymnosperms retain their seeds in the female cone. Angiosperms are going to be retained in a fruiting body or an ovary of a flowering plant. And so that's going to be something a little bit different there, but both of them are going to be able to wait until the right time to develop. So let's talk about our naked seed plants or our gymnosperms. Okay. Gymnosperms have well-developed vascular tissue that is often incredibly woody. Think about here in North Carolina, we have a lot of pines and junipers and cedars. These are very well developed, and they are often going to have a very, very hard wood tissue. That hardwood tissue is made up of the vascular tissue, and that does allow the plant to handle gravity, which is why some of the tallest trees in the world are going to be classified as gymnosperms, with those very large redwood trees out in California. But even here, a lot of our really tall trees that we see are often going to be those loblolly or longleaf pines here in North Carolina. These are found worldwide, but they absolutely dominate harsh environments. Now, harsh environments can vary, but they're often dry or wet or cold or hot or some combination of all of the above. So think about the tops of mountains where you're heading up towards the snow caps of mountains. Generally, those are going to be gymnosperms. You're heading up into the Arctic and you go through the boreal forest, gymnosperms, where there's tons of snow and they're covered by snow for a long part of the year. Even here in North Carolina, we are considered a harsh environment, especially along the coast. Okay, we have really acidic, sandy soil that tends to have a higher than normal salt content. We have periods of drought followed by insane amounts of water, and we often have high winds in association with tropical storms or hurricanes. In that case, we are a harsh environment, and pines do really, really well here. Um, I've been through a couple hurricanes living in North Carolina, and I think that usually when you go and look out, the pines, those loblolly pines and those longleaf pines, don't generally get decimated by that wind and the wet. But if we have like some of those so the angiosperms, things like the gum trees, even though they're native, or even like maple trees, tend to do worse. They tend to lose more limbs, they tend to fall over, they tend to break. Uh, Pines don't generally do that. They may lose a limb or two, and they're going to lose some of the needles and cones, but they don't fall over from the roots, which I think is a really key characteristic that makes them so successful here. Okay. They can reproduce asexually. Generally speaking, that'll just be growing up from the base, but most of them do rely on a sexual reproduction, and we are going to have both male and female cones. Now, the cones can vary. Some of the cones are a little fleshier, so things like your junipers or your ginkgos, those are cones, and if we were to look, we could find scales, which is how we identify them as cones, but they are a fleshier berry type. They are often misclassified in that case. It's kind of a misnomer in calling them berries. But then we also have your cycads, which are also called sago palms, and you'll find them for sale at like Home Depot and stuff as a sago palm, but they are not a palm tree. They are actually a conifer. They are actually a gymnosperm. They're not a conifer, they're a cycad. They are actually a gymnosperm. So they do have cones as a form of reproduction, and that's how we classify this particular group. A lot of them do have needle-like leaves, or leaves that are well adapted to handling that dry, harsh environment. And what we do know is that all of these guys, their pollen is wind dispersed. Their seeds are wind dispersed. In some cases, animals may disperse the seeds. So like the ginkgo is sometimes eaten by animals. The junipers, like sometimes eaten by animals. But a lot of cases, the wind is seed dispersed, or commonly here, the squirrels will also take those. They'll take the cones, they'll take them apart, and they'll move the seeds around. But more often than not, seed and pollen is wind dispersed. Okay. When we look at our conifers, which is the group we're most familiar with here in North Carolina, if you've been around in mid-March and your car is yellow, a lot of people blame the pines, which they are responsible, but it's also the oaks, the maples, and the birches at that time as well. But if you look at the ends of the trees, on the ends of their branches, you'll often see these yellow clusters of structures. These are the pollen cones. Pollen cones are the male cone of a pine, and they are going to produce produce large amounts of pollen. Again, wind dispersal doesn't mean that you're going to be guaranteed success. So you have to produce a ton of small pollen grains that can move around effectively on the wind and hopefully reach a developing female cone. When you find a female cone, that's going to be that more woody, kind of tough structure, and those are your seed cones. Those are going to retain the developing seed until it is mature. So sometimes it can be a really long time before those seeds are produced. The loblolly and longleaf pines often hold on to the female cones for 2 years before seeds start being produced. There are some that the seed cones are covered in a waxy coating and are only able to release the seeds at a certain temperature because they're used to forest fires. We have a lot of different ways that these seed cones do function. They are going to retain those seeds, and the seeds often have a development of the seed coat that's like a wing. So if you go out and you find a seed cone here and you kind of pull it apart and you see these little like paper thin looking structures, those are what we would call the wing, and those are going to be the helicopter structure that allows these seeds to move away from the parent plant. Within our conifers, we have the oldest living and the tallest living plants. The bristlecone pine is the oldest living tree, and if you look up pictures of them, they look dead. They're not. They just grow like maybe half an inch a year, and they grow very, very slowly. They have some needles, but they do look mostly dead. But they have lived to be 4,500 years old is the current oldest one, and one that was cut down was expected to have been 4,900 years old. That's a really long time. 4,900 years old, almost 5,000 years old in a single individual. So when we talk about this group, they are very well adapted to that slow growth, putting down wood, handling those harsh environments. Okay. The last group that we're going to talk about is our angiosperms. And this is the one that if you thought about a plant, this is probably the number one plant on your list. So these are your covered seeds. This is the majority of our food sources. Now, that's not to say that we don't eat the other groups of plants, but if you think about the foods that you consume, this is going to be your group here. There are woody stems common. There are herbaceous common. They are found worldwide. They are cultivated. They are cultivated for beauty with flowers. They're cultivated for plants. They really are 6 times the number of other species of plant groups combined, and they are hugely important to our survival as humans. They also do produce sexually and asexually, so all plants are capable of doing this. Some of these plants prefer to just reproduce asexually. There's one that's called the mother of thousands, and all along the leaf, it'll put out these little plantlets that'll drop off and grow into new plants, and it doesn't really produce a flower unless it's absolutely necessary. Grass tends to grow asexually. When you see that crabgrass crawling across the ground, that is a type of asexual reproduction because it is growing from one base. But they are also going to have flowers. So these groups do have flowers, and their flowers can be perfect or imperfect, and their flowers can be pollinated in a lot of different ways. We still see a lot of wind pollination in things like our grasses, our maples, our oaks, our birches. If you go out in the spring and you see on some of like the oaks and birch trees, these kind of long, dangly structures, those are the flowers. They are the male producing flowers, and they are producing pollen similar to what we see in the pollen cones. We do also have directed pollination with insects, birds, and mammals, which can be hugely key to the characteristics we see in a lot of these flowers. If we have flowers that are imperfect, that means that there's a male and a female flower that are separate. Perfect flowers are the ones that have both male and female parts together. And the showier the flower, the more specific it is to the pollinator. So we can often tell pollination, who's pollinating these flowers, based on the physical structures of the flowers themselves. So for instance, something like a purple cone flower is going to be that large flat landing pad, and just about any nectar consuming insect will land on that. But if you see something like a honeysuckle that has that really deep, they call them a throat, right? The really deep part of the flower that goes back, that is going to be that bright red color or orange color as well. That's not meant to attract bees, that's meant to attract hummingbirds. And so we do see some of these physical characteristics of the flowers based on their pollinators. Okay, let's talk about the perfect flower just a little bit, and then I want to talk a little bit about what's called the directed pollination hypothesis. So, first off, most flowers have certain parts, whether or not they have separate flowers with male and female or a perfect flower where male and female is contained. We are going to see structures that are characterized, and so we know that they share an evolutionary history. Okay, flowers are going to have petals. Now the petals can be really reduced in our wind pollinated flowers, because if I have to get wind, I'm not trying to attract anything. But in our insect and animal and plant pollinated flowers, the petals are often very brightly colored, very, very flamboyant. They are a marketing scheme where they are saying, hey, food here. In the flower, we are going to also have what's called a sepal, so that kind of green structure that protects the developing bud, and then we often see the seed retained within that sepal as well. In the petal itself, okay, within the petals, we are going to have the male and the female parts. The male parts are called stamens, and the female part is called the carpel. The stamens are going to have those yellow pollen-producing structures called anthers. So if you've ever seen a lily, I hate the smell of lilies. I tend to not have them ever on hand. But a lily is going to have those very clear, obvious anthers that look just like the ones in this picture here. Or then you have the carpel, which is in the middle. And the carpel is going to have a sticky part on top called a stigma. That stigma is going to be where the pollen can stick to. So when we have a pollinator visiting in a flower, okay, the pollinator is going to pick up pollen, not usually intentionally. More often than not, it is going for the nectar. So this is kind of an example of what we would call coevolution or mutualism, where it's going for the nectar, it gets fed a meal, the flower is advertising that meal, it's bright, it's colorful, and the pollinator gets covered in pollen. If that pollinator goes from one flower to another of the same species, it increases the chances of fertilization because that pollinator is carrying that pollen in a directed way. This is better than what we see in wind pollination, where you have to produce a ton of pollen and hope that it lands where it needs to be. In this case, you can produce less pollen, and so you kind of do an energy exchange, where instead of producing a ton of pollen, you're producing energy in that nectar. That nectar is your trade-off, but you want that pollinator. So if you are attracting hummingbirds, you don't want the hummingbird to go visit a different species of flower. You want the hummingbird to go from one individual of a species to another, to another, to another. And that is what we consider the directed pollination. So where you are having a pollinator visit all of the same species. This can lead to some of those unique traits we see in flowers because that is the pressure there. That's that natural selection pressure. And the directed pollination hypothesis is really tied into insects and insect flight. The more that insects were able to move around effectively from one flower to another, the more pressure there was on the flowers to kind of monopolize that pollinator's time. So when we see these really unique flowers, like the honeysuckle. Sorry, my brain stopped for a second on what flower I was thinking of. Like the honeysuckles, we're not trying to see every single pollinator type go to that flower. We want a very specific pollinator, and we want to make it worth their time and effort to visit enough of those flowers that the pollination is going to be a guaranteed success, as compared to things like daisies, which are just a free-for-all and just hoping that there's enough visitation by different pollinators that there is pollination success. Obviously, it's worked very well because we do have these angiosperms literally everywhere in the world, and we have these flowers with their pollinators very closely associated to them. Okay, within angiosperms, okay, there are two major divisions of our angiosperm groups, and this gets to you to play one of my favorite games. My husband and stepson don't think it's a fun game, but I think it's a fun game, and I play it with my students too when we go out during lab and seated classes. You can tell if an angiosperm, one, you should be able to identify all four classes of plants, the bryophytes, pteridophytes, gymnosperms, and angiosperms, okay? Just going on a walk, you will see all four, and you should be able to identify all four based on the characteristics we've gone through, okay? Two, within your angiosperms, you should be able to identify monocots versus dicots, or monocotyledons versus eudicotyledons, okay? So How do we classify these two groups? Well, these are two ancestral divisions of our angiosperms. So monocots have a single first leaf. If you've ever watched grass grow or corn grow, there's one little leaf that pops up. That would make it a monocot. So there's one little first leaf called the cotyledon. In dicots, there's two little first leaves. So if you've ever watched bean or sunflower seeds sprout, there'll be two little first leaves. Those are your dicots, and they have, that's because they have two cotyledons. So dicots, okay? If you've ever looked at the roots of a plant, sometimes this can help you identify. So if you pull up something like a dandelion in your yard, my dad hated dandelions. I don't know why. I think they're fabulous. I love me a dandelion, okay? But dandelions have really deep tap roots. So if you pull up a dandelion and you don't get the entire root, that root will just produce a new plant, the new leaf part of the plant. So if you really want to get that, you have to pull up the whole root. It's got a very deep tap root. That's kind of like carrots, right? Carrots are a tap root. So you've got that kind of deep, thick, very starchy structure. That is going to be what is very characteristic of dicots, whereas monocots have more of a fibrous root. If you've ever pulled up grass, like you're weeding and you pull up, the grass here is insane. It gets everywhere, right? You pull up a bundle of grass and it has this kind of bushy hair-like structure that's almost bigger underground. That's generally a monocot. Okay. Now, you're not going to be able to see the vascular tissue effectively, generally speaking, because this is more a cellular thing. But if you were able to see the vascular tissue, in monocots, the vascular tissue, that xylem and phloem, is scattered throughout the entirety of the stem, whereas in dicots, it's ringed. It's also why our trees, like our maples and our oaks, have rings of growth, and your trees are dicots. So maples, oaks, any of those large woody trees that are not gymnosperms are dicots, okay? Here's where you can actually play the game effectively. So a lot of times when we're looking at plants and we're not pulling them up, we're not planting them, we're not looking at their cellular structures, we can look easily at their leaves. So if their leaves are in parallel veins and you can peel them in strips, in nice clean strips, again like grass. Grass is a classic monocot, or corn. That is going to be a monocot characteristic when those leaves are in nice parallel veins. But if you ever take like a maple or an oak leaf and you try to peel that, it kind of breaks off in little sections and pieces because they have net-like veins through the leaves. So their leaves are not in nice clean strips. Their leaves have veins kind of spread throughout the entirety. So that's your first characteristic that'll let you identify something as a monocot or a dicot. The second one is the flower. So you're not always going to see a flower, okay? But if you do see the flower, you can count the sepals, the green part of the flower, and you can identify it as a monocot or dicot based on the sepals themselves. So the sepals, if they're in multiples of 3, 3, 6, 9, okay, and other parts of the flowers too then, the petals, the stamens, the anthers, the carpels, those are all going to be in multiples of 3. I say to count the sepal if you can, because if you see dicots are in multiples of 4 or 5. Well, we have some overlap there, right, with 12 and 15. So if you see a flower that's got 15 petals, you won't know if it's a monocot or dicot unless you look at the sepals, because those will usually be in that base level there of 3 or 4 or 5. So if you find a flower and you look at the petals themselves and you count 4 petals, it's a dicot. If you count 12, look at the sepals. But in any case, you should be able to do this very quickly and easily on a walk. And I do want you guys to do that. I want you to go out as part of lab for the plant lab, and I want you to identify one of each plant, okay, based on your classification characteristics that you know, and also identify different plants as monocots and dicots. You'll see the lab instructions in Canvas, okay, but I do want you to do that as well. Last but not least, we have to talk about the economic and ecological benefit of plants, which we've already done throughout this entire thing, okay? Plants are hugely important for us as humans. One, for food, okay? I love this charcuterie board. It's not even got meat on it, and I'm here for it, okay? We've got all of the breads, right? If you like breads, if you like grains, if you like cereals, if you like pickles or fruits or vegetables. By the way, vegetables are a culinary term. When plants, it's all fruits. Even grains are a fruit, okay? So it's a fruiting plant anyway. If you like those things, if you like eating food, even if you like eating meat, your meat ate plants. So when we talk about the economic benefit of plants, food is a huge one. You also have a lot of commercial products made from plants. You have pharmaceutical innovations. A lot of our drugs began as a plant-based source. So things like aloe vera, things like aspirin, things like even some of our chemo drugs were a plant structure toxin that was then modified to be a cancer treatment. Like, how cool is that? Okay. In addition, if you plant flowers in your yard, that is a huge economic benefit. If you buy flowers, like all of that, okay? And then you obviously have your ecological benefits. Like without plants, there would be no oxygen. We know this. Without plants, there would be no basis for cellular respiration because we need photosynthesis to trap solar energy and convert it into a chemical energy that our cells can use. Cellular respiration is dependent on plants, okay? Oxygen too, but even just glucose, right? Forests play a really big role in water and carbon cycles and maintaining the balance of those nutrient cycles. Plants are hugely important in containing toxic substances. Wetlands do a really good job of removing pollution from water before it gets into major waterways. And plants retain soil. Plants that are native are really good at withstanding the different ecological factors, and they'll retain soil, they'll keep your yard shady, they reduce the amount of energy that you have to use to cool and heat your home. Just in general, we should really appreciate plants. So here is your check your understanding for plants. If you have questions, let me know. Go outside, look for some plants, look for some characteristics, find some monocots and dicots and tell me why they are, and I'll see you in the next lecture.